Good afternoon, everybody. I guess we'll just go ahead and get started, and others can join us as they're able. But welcome, as always, to the conversation. My name is David Sertz with Cooperative Strategies, and we are continuing the theme of mental health and reopening by having the necessary conversation about school security and safety as it relates to the topic, and as we look forward to reopening en masse that's happening as we speak. And we are honored and excited to have Mo Canady with us from the National Association of School Resource Officers. Great connection here to the conversation, and we are going to get right to it. So as a point of introduction, Mo holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Jackson State. He worked with the police department in Hoover, Alabama for 25 years, retiring in 2011, and spent the last 12 years of his career supervisor of the School Services Division. And he is past president of the Alabama Association of School Resource Officers and is current executive director of NASRO. And he is going to lead our conversation today about the role of security thinking in SROs in particular, what a best practice looks like. He's also having here a brief article that he responds about what some less than best practices look like and why, and how that ties into our conversation. Again, really excited to have him here. And Mo, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. That happened quickly. So David, thanks for having me. It really is an honor to spend time with you all this afternoon, and I appreciate all the participants that have joined. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat box. I was trying to catch up on that, and once I get to the end of my presentation, I'll finish catching up. But I mentioned to David as I first got on, I am currently in Denver. My home base is Alabama. That's where our national office is located and where I've lived for 57 years. So, but we have a national conference coming up here in Denver next summer in 2022. So out here doing a little prep work around that, and also to originally testify regarding a bill on school safety that actually appears to have that bill. I think the phrase is the bill's been killed. So I don't know if that's the proper phraseology, but that's what brings me here to Denver. But good to join you all to talk a little bit about school resource officers and school reopening and what that is going to look like. And I really like the way David actually laid these slides out, and I really like the way this first one's laid out, because it gets us straight to the point in talking about school resource officers. There was actually a little bit of pre-conversation that was going on about 10 minutes or so ago, and one of your colleagues was asking me about the definition of school resource officers, and I think I'm going to throw this in with that slide, and I'm not going to quote the definition, but I'm going to tell you 3 important points from it. A school resource officer should be a sworn certified law enforcement officer. That's point 1. Secondly, they should be engaged in community-based policing. That means community-based policing on the school campus. And thirdly, it should be a really strong collaborative effort between the school district and the law enforcement agency. When I think about this mental health issue and the return to school, and I've shared this with David, I think our concern tracks right along with our friends in the mental health world, is that we are very concerned about the mental health of students and faculty too, and parents, all of us, as school returns, but we really begin to see that impact on students. I spent some time this morning at Arapahoe High School here in Colorado, and they have their full student body back, and it was interesting just to watch the dynamics of class change, how everything has changed. And we know it has to have had a significant impact on students, even students who don't normally exhibit maybe mental health issues or challenges. But I think it all brings us to the issue of the number one goal of a school resource officer. And this is really foundational to the way we train SROs. We're training these officers, hopefully veteran officers, who are transitioning into this most unique assignment in law enforcement. There's really nothing else like it, not even comparable. But the number one goal should be to bridge the gap between law enforcement and youth, really to create positive relationships with youth. One of the things that we know is that positive relationships, good relationships with the community, whatever part of the community we're serving from a law enforcement standpoint, leads to good information. Now, that's not necessarily the reason we want to establish the good relationship. We want to establish it to be good community partners. But by establishing that really positive relationship with students, with faculty, with parents, it winds up in some very valuable intelligence at times. Certainly a good exchange of information. If you think about it, any of you that I don't know if anyone on here has been in law enforcement previously, but when you have a good relationship with someone and there's an exchange of information, that's so much better than the old the classic informant situation. When you're in a relationship with someone, and we see this with SROs and students, especially all the time, there's a really good flow of information. The students are less apprehensive about coming forward to the SRO or to someone with information that could give us the opportunity to stop an act of school violence before it ever occurs. As a matter of fact, the National Police Foundation houses something called the Averted School Violence Database. Within that database are a number of anecdotal stories of a student, a parent, or a faculty member sharing something with an SRO, giving the SRO the opportunity to engage in an investigation, and in many instances, probably stop an act of school violence before it ever occurred. But the relationship is certainly the goal, and it should be genuine. If we're trying to engage in a relationship with someone just to get information, that's not genuine. So it doesn't need to be a means to another end. Students will figure that out. If we're not genuine, especially with students, they're going to figure that out. We train SROs on the importance of understanding adolescent brain development, that even with their developing brains, they can figure out pretty quickly if an adult is not genuine with them. And also in that relationship, it's so critically important that the SRO follows through, that they not promise things they can't deliver, and that they are absolutely honest with students, because if that doesn't work out somewhere along the way, that relationship could be lost forever. So it really is, it's not, the number one goal is not to go and stand at a door to help try to prevent an active shooter incident from occurring. The number one goal is not to see how many drug arrests you can make as an SRO. Those things are not the number one goal. But if we keep the first thing in mind and keep the first thing first, the rest of it will fall in place. We'll have a better chance of keeping drugs out of our schools. Certainly drug dealers. We'll have a better chance of keeping trespassers off the school property. We'll have a better chance of stopping something horrible from happening. One of the things that is so difficult to quantify is police presence, law enforcement presence. It really does matter. We know that it has an impact. I know that when I was a police officer, that my presence, uniformed presence, mattered. The car mattered. And so the presence of an SRO in a school environment can really matter in that regard. David, could we see the next slide? So there are some things that we're really specific about that have to occur, or the SRO idea, the SRO program is going to fail. It's not going to work unless these three things occur. And I like to think of it as a three-legged stool. If I were going to sit down on a three-legged stool and one of the legs is missing, I'm going to the ground. So we're going to talk about, as you see on this slide, SRO selection, and then I'm going to share two other pieces of the legs of that stool. But this is one of the most critical things that administration and a law enforcement agency, and hopefully even an administration with the school district, is going to be engaged in. And by the way, I do recommend that school administration have some involvement in the process. When I was an SRO supervisor, we just about always included a school administrator in that interview process, sometimes more than one, because their feedback is critically important. We're assigning this officer to work in their world. And so it should matter what the educators think, what the administration thinks. But this selection process, really, we should be focused on a few things here. We should be focused on selecting a veteran officer. And these are not necessarily in order of what I'm about to share with you, but we should focus on selecting a veteran officer. Our best practices organizationally strongly suggest that the officer have at least 3 years with their agency. And by doing that, it automatically gives the agency the opportunity to really know this officer that they're about to select, to know about their character, to know about their work ethic, to know if they have any discipline problems in their history. So it really is, it puts a lot of things in context. Also, this assignment is not for a new law enforcement officer. This is really about taking that skill set that a veteran officer has developed and adapting it for the school environment. And so that's most critical. So it should be a veteran officer. SRO candidates should have a history of serving youth in a volunteer capacity. So we're looking at things like, baseball and softball coaches, any kind of, youth sports coaches, Boys and Girls Club leaders, scout leaders. There are a lot of things we could name here, but we want to see that level of effort in terms of really connecting with youth in a positive way and building positive relationships. Another piece of this selection process certainly relates to the officer's public relations skills. And so that's going to be really important. Also, is this a person that has shown a history of being calm and approachable? One of the most important things we're going to do as SROs, other than building the relationships, is problem solve. And so that needs to be a key component of this. Is this an officer that has a history of knowing how to de-escalate critical situations? When they approach a situation where a crisis is going on, have they been able to effectively de-escalate some of those situations? And we know we're not going to de-escalate every situation we get into. I relate this to pepper spray. De-escalation doesn't work all the time. If it does, that's a great day. That's a really great day. Same thing with pepper spray. When I was a young officer and being trained with pepper spray, we had to be sprayed with it. And part of the reasoning there, and I understand it, was to know how you're going to react so that if you were engaged in a situation and you're the one that got sprayed, you can survive the situation, right? I didn't think I was going to survive that spray. No, I'll say that. But what was interesting was we were all lined up, and one of the officers standing next to me was a young woman about my age. We were young at the time, and I get hosed with the pepper spray, and I go to my knees. I mean, it was brutal. For her, it was as if she had been sprayed with water. So here are all of us tough guys, crying, and I won't explain the whole process to you, and she's just oblivious to it all. It's like she's been sprayed with water. And it was a really good learning moment, teachable moment, that whatever the tool is, and I know this is kind of a raw example, but whatever the tool is not going to work on everyone, and it's not going to work all the time. Yes, we want officers who are capable of de-escalating situations and events. But we also want them to be prepared for whatever the next level has to be to protect everyone. So that's really, really important, again, that officers have kind of that skill set. So that's the selection process is really the first leg of the stool that if we don't get that right, none of the rest of it's going to go right. SROs are going to become the most well-known officers in their community, more well-known than the chief or the sheriff. And it's just the nature of the beast. And it's going to be a good thing or it's going to be a bad thing. And so we got to do everything we can to get this selection issue right on the front end. And as careful as I've always tried to be, I've made a couple of mistakes myself in thinking I had the right person and I didn't. And so then you got to go through the upheaval process of getting that person out of the assignment and trying to get it right the next time. So we like to try and get it right, certainly the first time. So selection is the first leg. Second leg, I won't go deep into, but specific training. We train SROs around a number of issues. I mentioned adolescent brain development, implicit bias, special needs, understanding that process, adolescent mental health issues, school law, what's different about the approach of the law around things like search and seizure, or interview and interrogation techniques, or arrest procedures in the school environment. So they have to be trained specifically. That's the second leg of the stool. The third leg is there has to be good collaboration between the school district and law enforcement agency. So without those three legs of the stool, we're going to have a program that's not going to work. So we got to make sure we get all of those things right on the front end. David, next slide, please. So David was referencing, and there are a couple of things that I'd like to talk about here, and I'll start by talking about the one you see, kind of our response to a recent Maryland incident. This happened, I don't know if any of you are from Montgomery County, Maryland, so this happens to have occurred in a district that has, I think finally, I don't know the end result here, so I don't want to be too forward in this, but I think they have finally made the decision to eliminate their SRO program. So this is a situation where two patrol officers wound up dealing with this 5-year-old child who had left campus. And some of you have probably seen the video. And so NASRO did condemn it. As a former law enforcement officer, condemning actions of law enforcement is sometimes not the easiest thing for me to do, but sometimes is necessary. And in this situation, it was necessary. Our concern was really, one of our concerns was really highlighted by this incident. And I'm not trying to use this incident to make a point, but there is a point here, unfortunately. You know, with some of the movement to remove SROs in some schools, and it's a very, in my opinion, a very quick knee-jerk reaction. I'm afraid we're going to face situations like this. Look, good SROs being carefully selected and specifically trained are some of the best filters to this kind of issue. I am convinced, I'm totally convinced that a carefully selected and specifically trained SRO would have handled this completely differently, in a completely different manner. There's no doubt in my mind. I know the SROs that I worked with for many years would have handled it in a different way. And it's not because SROs are necessarily better than patrol officers. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. Patrol officers are the backbone of any law enforcement agency. They have an important job to do. But SROs being specifically selected to work with youth and being specifically trained to work with youth is an absolute difference maker. You've got SROs in this situation that understand a lot of developmental issues going on with a 5-year-old child that a patrol officer might not understand because they haven't been trained in it necessarily. And it's not a part of their day-to-day life, quite frankly, in terms of the work that they're doing, whereas it is for an SRO. So you'll see here, again, it reinforces our concern about potential unintended consequences of removing these carefully selected and specifically trained SROs. So without those SROs, then schools will have to rely on patrol officers to respond. And again, as I mentioned, they're critical, but they're not always well trained and don't necessarily have the relationship to work with youth in a particular school environment. And that just, I can't make it any more simple than that. You know, SRO programs that adhere to national best practices use only carefully selected and specifically trained officers can mitigate these kinds of consequences. And so we go on in our press release to talk about this selection issue and this training issue. You'll see the last sentence here. Some incidences on campus require the involvement of police officers. And we feel strongly that students are much better off when the officers involved are carefully selected and specifically trained school resource officers. So it grieves me to see some communities removing that really valuable and important resource. I quite often refer to good SROs as filters to arrest. We've got from 1996 to 2018, juvenile arrests across this country have dropped by almost 73%. That doesn't just happen by accident. Now, look, I'm not crediting all of that to SROs, please don't get me wrong. But I am saying that SRO ranks have risen exponentially during that period of time. And so it is interesting, as the juvenile arrest rate has come down, SRO growth has gone up. So we really do spend a lot of time talking about the issues around arrests, school-based arrests, and how we can reduce those in an appropriate way, in a proper way. One of the things that an SRO has in that school environment at their disposal are other resources, whereas the patrol officer on the street may not have that. So we have other opportunities to maybe divert issues as opposed to having to make arrests. Sometimes an arrest has to be made. We all know that. But when a good SRO is in place, it's more rare than a regular occurrence. And David, do I have just a couple more minutes?
Yeah, please. And I was going to ask you a little follow-up question on some of the data later, but I think, go ahead, please.
Well, the other is more of an anecdotal story probably than I would call it a case study, but it may be a little bit of both. And I think that I think it's important to relate this story because it happened at an interesting time. 2 days before the Sandy Hook tragedy occurred, I was sitting in Washington, D.C. in a Senate hearing, and it was a Senate hearing called Ending the School to Prison Pipeline. And the focus of this hearing was to blame school resource officers for causing more juveniles to go into the juvenile justice system at the same time that juvenile arrests are coming down, by the way. A friend of mine was one of the individuals testifying at this hearing. And he actually got the last say in the hearing. And he's not an SRO, never been a law enforcement officer. He's a juvenile court judge and a highly regarded juvenile court judge. And so he was asked by the senator who was leading this hearing if he thought we should just remove SROs throughout the country. And again, I'll mention again, 2 days before the Sandy Hook tragedy. The judge's response was, if we do that, then we're going to miss opportunities like this. And then he goes on to share, and I'm summarizing and paraphrasing, about an SRO who's a veteran SRO in a school in his county, had been called to a classroom for a female student that was out of control. So the SRO went to the classroom, and what she saw there surprised her, because this was a student, kind of like we're talking about mental health issues right now, that she had never seen act out in this way. The student was throwing things, cursing, screaming, really out of control. So the SRO, de-escalated the situation, her presence, talking the girl down, and talked the girl into going down to the administrative offices with her, just to talk. And so they went down there and had a very long conversation. And what happened in that conversation was the young girl revealed to the SRO that she had been being sexually abused by her mother's live-in boyfriend for over a year. So the SRO, with that information, obviously initiates an investigation, and what happens is the boyfriend is eventually convicted, and the student was directed toward the help that she needed. I don't know where the student is today, in her adult life. Hopefully she got past that, and hopefully the SRO is a big part of that. But what I do know is that if we hadn't had that SRO there, that carefully selected, specifically trained SRO, what would that situation have looked like? What would the ending have looked like if the school had called 911 for assistance from police? I would suggest to you strongly that it probably would have ended in an arrest for disorderly conduct or something along those lines. That's the value of carefully selected, specifically trained SROs that certainly have many anecdotal stories of those types of things. I know it's hard to quantify and to really put into significant data, but it's an important story to relate. And I know that we have SROs out here doing this kind of work every day, all day long. So, David, thanks for letting me share
Yeah,
that. I will
sure thing. Yeah, and just kind of a follow-up question. The where this conversation got started, and of course, we're looking at different realities that we're facing and coming back to school after this extraordinary time. And we've talked about the facility side of things and indoor air quality quite a bit. And now we're on the mental health and this closing achievement gaps and so forth. From your standpoint, when we ask right there where you are in Denver, folks from student services there in Jeffco, like how are you preparing? What are you anticipating when you come back as a response to this year? What are you preparing for? And their framing was really helpful for folks who are not experts like ourselves in their work. And they said, well, there's 3 layers of support that we think of. One is what's a universal layer of support, sort of preemptive in the culture at the school. What's that tier 1 culture element that we're working on as student services to create a positive, nurturing, healthy culture? 2, we're looking at sort of more groups and cohorts that need identified, and a tier 3 is individuals, right? So, and their response was, we need a tier 1 plan for everybody. Like, we have to amp up our game in preparing for everybody's going to come back with exacerbated needs at some level. We don't know who, but we're going to assume that everybody needs some level of intervention, and we're going to prepare for that, our resources, which I think was really helpful. That they're thinking, okay, everybody's going to need more of a heightened layer of response. Here's our protocols rather for what those responses are: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And we're going to assume that we need to put more of these tier 2 in place than we typically do. From your standpoint, working with SROs and thinking and about, and as you were, like, for example, preparing for your summer conference this year and talking with SROs, what are you all talking about in preparing for the stressors that the adults and the students are going to come back with that are heightened, if nothing else?
We're actually, first of all, in terms of the conference, we're going to have a strong focus on mental health. By the way, not just students, but also adults' mental health.
Yeah.
We have to look at ourselves also. So what does that do to the SRO or to the counselor or to the school psychologist even? So we're going to be looking at that as well. We have a really fantastic panel session that's being put together for the Tuesday afternoon of our conference that's going to be led by Michelle Gay. And some of you know Michelle. She is a Sandy Hook mom, a fantastic school safety professional now. She's done some incredible work and a great friend of ours. So I'm excited about that panel session and the interactions going to take place with that. We're going to have some mental health professionals on that panel that can speak to these very issues. I mean, obviously, we're concerned with this return to school. I think one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is, and this is probably not the right word to use, but it's one that comes to mind, and that is surveillance. And I'm not talking about spying on people, but more observation, more the adults, especially those that are have been part of that school safety and security team. We're talking about not just SROs, but again, school mental health professionals. We're talking about school nurses, counselors, those kind of folks who are engaged at that level, really having their head on a swivel and being watchful for situations that arise students in crisis. You know, as one principal mentioned to me a few weeks ago, she used a phrase called ghost cases. You know, those students that have never really exhibited, you know, severe mental health issues. You know, being aware of that happening, back to the observation and just, you know, that using those relationships when we talk about tier one, you know, as students come back. And I saw it today walking around Arapahoe High School with with Deputy Englert. I saw it today, his engagement with students as they're going through the hallway, and, you know, getting back to some of those normalized relationships, even, you know, with a mask on for now, it is going to be critical, I think. And so again, I'll go back to observation, because I think that's at the top level of having your head on a swivel and being aware of what's going on around you, especially with students.
And what are you looking for now that maybe is unique to the moment, at least in degree, if not in substance? Like when you say had it a swivel, what are we looking for? I'm assuming it's emotional trauma, signs thereof. Like, what is it that you're thinking we need to be that much more vigilant in looking for?
I'm ultimately concerned about a student with some of this mental health baggage that they're going to unfortunately be dragging with them, acting out in violent ways. I'm not suggesting, you know, the majority of students are going to do that, but I think that this brings another level of concern. I think if we look at what happened just north of where I sit in Boulder, you know, I hope that's not the expectation that's ahead of us, but I think that we've got to, certainly, we want to make sure that students who act out in a different way than we've ever seen, whether it's, you know, yelling and screaming at somebody, getting in a fight, a student who we would have never thought would have gotten in a fight, you know, a student, saying things to a teacher that they never would have said, those kind of simple things we need to be watching out for. But again, I'm ultimately concerned about us really watching for that escalation that might occur that would really begin to concern us. Could this turn into an act of violence? I don't think we can overlook anything. And I think that, certainly the National Threat Assessment Center with the Secret Service provides some great resources in regards to how we approach not only the mental health aspect of this, but the threat assessment piece of this. The student who is in such distress and such, a difficult mental health situation that it could become a threatening issue to the safety of that student or other students or adults on campus. Those are the things that I want to be watchful for. The student who is expressing themselves in a more violent way through their art, whatever it may be, we all need to be aware and watching for those things that are different, especially again with students who never exhibited that.
And not to take us too much of a tangent here, but obviously, brought you on because this is not our wheelhouse, and yet we know in hearing in front, this is obviously something that we have to contend with, and we want to be prepared on the operations side and so forth. How do you train or talk to your officers and schools about doing this, being extra vigilant as you're describing, and balancing that with, without going too far, right? In terms of creating we want to have our head on a swivel, we want to be observant, but we don't want to, create a culture of where you can't express yourself. You mentioned art, right? Like if my kid's drawing something that's
Right.
violent art, right? There's obviously balances here, right? And how do you help, or how can you help us, and how do you talk to your officers about how to walk that line between vigilance without, overcompensating, overcorrecting?
Yeah, I'm one personally who appreciates art, and some of the things, especially that you see students do, is just phenomenal. When I was an SRO, I used to spend time as much as I could on E-Hall, because E-Hall was the art wing, and so whether it's photography or sketches, they would place those on the walls of E-Hall in the school I worked. And just there were some phenomenal things. There was a teacher one time who got concerned and asked me to come and look at some of the artwork a student was engaged in. And it was radically different than just being edgy art, if that makes sense. I understand
sure.
art can be edgy. This was not just edgy.
Uh-huh.
This was depicting school shootings. This was depicting the student as the school shooter. It was this student had, as we dug deeper into this student was fascinated with the movie The Crow. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, it was a movie that Brandon Lee starred in. It became kind of a cult classic in that particular generation. And but he was so consumed with this and obsessed with this that he thought when Brandon Lee, the actor, died, that he inherited his soul. So you can begin to see, as we peeled back the layers of the onion, and obviously we did a lot more than just law enforcement interaction in this.
Sure.
We did some pretty deep, mental health professional assistance. So it's that kind of thing, right? It's not, we don't need to be, certainly, the word won't come to me that I'm looking for, but suppressing students' ability to express themselves is not what we want to do. I think, one of the keys is just to maintain those relationships with them, talk to them as you normally did before the pandemic hit. And more than talking, be a good listener. Let's listen twice as much as we talk. A lot of students, I firmly believe, are just need somebody to listen to them. And so when we're good listeners, it can really be of great help in terms of de-escalating situations before they go any further. And it doesn't have to be reporting the student to this person or that person. It can happen in a conversation. So I think we're going to face a lot of that. I do.
Yeah. And speaking of which, when you and I were previewing this conversation, you said something to the effect of, forgive me for paraphrasing, but the worst way to address a politically charged situation is with an emotionally charged response, or something like that, something to that effect. And when we're talking about these tougher conversations, you sort of really speak in our language in terms of data, like having data-driven discussion. So for those of us in our world, we kind of know what kind of data we're looking for in facility and operational planning and finance and so forth. In school security, in what are the data sets? What are the tools? What are the facts that we can go to help ground some of these conversations moving forward? Because we will have them in our schools. If we haven't already, the national conversation is there. What do you recommend that we seek out and use to ground our discussions about school security, SROs, and in data? Where are the places that you go?
First of all, I think what we're talking about here is tough from a data standpoint. And let me explain what I mean by that. I talked about officer presence a few minutes ago, how difficult that is to quantify. I think that officer SRO student relationships are difficult to quantify. I'll give you a couple of examples.
Mhm.
Well, let me say one other thing and then I'll give you a couple of examples. That a few years ago during I believe it was the second term of the Obama administration, we got engaged with a group from Georgetown around the issue of SROs and their relationship to girls of color.
Mhm.
And it was really eye-opening. I really enjoyed engaging on this subject. As a matter of fact, we were working with them to put together a breakout session for our national conference this coming summer. It'll be kind of virtual, and it will be. The original idea was we were going to have some of the girls themselves come to the conference, and they were pretty excited about that. Obviously, to come to Orlando, but the session is what really interested us because you had, as the leaders described me, some of the girls had really positive relationships with SROs, some did not. And so we really were looking forward to, and we're still looking forward to digging into the details around that. And I think our attendees are going to be knee deep in this. I think that they are really going to engage in this session. I'm very excited about it. But a couple of examples, and again, these are anecdotal type things. One of the SROs that used to work for me, he just recently retired, but he was assigned at one of our largest high schools, and he was white male and not really from an extremely diverse background. And this was a fairly diverse school population. And I had concerns as to how he was going to relate to the minority population. And it wasn't that his heart wasn't in that, don't get me wrong, but it
Mhm.
was a different culture for him.
Mhm.
What was interesting was by the close of his career, the group of students that were most drawn to him were African American girls. And his wife had a horrible battle with cancer during part of his time as an SRO, and she unfortunately passed away. And it was a group of African American girls that had gotten very close to him that went around to the entire school having everyone do sympathy cards for him. And they brought them to him in this basket, and someone videotaped it. And it was one of the most moving things I've ever seen. I know that there are SROs that do that kind of work all day long, every day. As a matter of fact, while I was at Arapahoe High School a while ago, this conversation came up
Mhm.
around SROs, especially not just law enforcement, but SROs and their engagement um, with minority youth. And they were telling me about a club. I don't know if it's a club or an organization that had formed. It's not a Black Lives Matter organization, but it's an African American initiative of some type. And so the SROs wind up now going to those club meetings and having really engaging conversations with the students. And now, it has, according to what they just shared with me, developed into some really incredible relationships. Another example, and again, it's anecdotal in nature. I realize that we have another SRO in Baltimore County that this goes back to the Baltimore riots when those occurred. That he found himself for several days in the classroom with students, engaging around law enforcement issues and what's right and wrong. So I think, again, this is the slide says data driven, and I'm giving you anecdotal information here that I don't know if you can really pull data out of, but I, I see our members taking these kinds of issues on straightforward. I don't see our members running away from this. I'm not going to run away from this. I was asked at a town hall meeting about 4 years ago by the host, and I was really put on the spot. But she asked me, because there is distrust in some African American communities with the law enforcement, there's distrust there. Why would we want to have SROs in schools? And my response was, and again, we're talking about carefully selected and specifically trained officers here. My response was, if we don't get this right with the current generation of youth, how are we ever going to get it right as they become adults? So I believe that's important, and I believe that's an important thing for us to get our hands around. Somewhere along the way, we've got to get this relationship right. And I'm not suggesting that SROs are going to solve everything around cultural issues, issues around poverty, racial issues. We're not going to solve all of that, but one student at a time, we have the opportunity to make a difference. And that's the way I view this. Sorry, I went on and on there, but
no, Mo, I appreciate that. What I was listening to is that through line of relationships that you keep mentioning there, and the listening, in that when we are coming back to school, the national strife between particularly African American community and in the law enforcement, it's reflected in our schools. It's going to come in, and it's present, even if it's not mentioned. And having sort of strategies to engage in those dialogues that are constructive is kind of parcel of this slide, part of the point. And when you and I were previewing, and I do appreciate, and we can take note of that central goal of building relationships, which are more listening than talking, as you put it there, being part of it, being the key strategy here to have your SRO community engaged with youth, particularly when youth in our minority communities are having these hard conversations, to listen, to be a part of that. You've also mentioned, and without sort of a direct end goal in mind, except the relationship itself, keeping that present, which I appreciate your focus on. What data, to me, you mentioned some statistics about reduction in youth incarceration, youth arrest over time. Where should we go when having these conversations in our schools to get real facts, to talk about youth incarceration and youth and youth arrest, and talk about violent crime, and talk about police incidents and police brutality? Where do you go? Is it FBI crime statistics? Is it the Secret Service database you mentioned about? Where can you point us to ground some data on these facts?
How about straight to the source? And I don't mean that in a condescending way. People seem to, and I don't want to categorize everyone when I say people, not a broad brush here, but people seem to, especially if there's an agenda at place here, or at play, talk around us on this issue. My point is, why not come straight to us on this issue? One of the things that is brought up to me quite often is school arrest data. And every time that's brought up, I have a question. And my question is, who's making the arrests? I think most researchers will agree, there's not a lot of data out there that shows who's making the arrests. It's really easy in some communities to get the data and say, wow, 200 students were arrested at X school last year, this many felonies, this many misdemeanors, but the question is still there. Who made the arrest? Last year during our virtual conference, and so maybe I'm offering an opportunity here that might help out. We posed a question, and what we learned a lot about by doing a virtual conference, by the way. I didn't want to do it. I was dreading it, and came out of it going, man, I learned a lot. And we're going to keep doing that as a side piece, sidebar of our national conference. If you can't be there in person, do the virtual conference and still get in on the general sessions and some of the survey material. And so we surveyed, we put the survey out, in between sessions, and had a ton of respondents. And the question was, during the previous school year as an SRO, before the pandemic hit, how many students did you arrest? And I'm talking about an on view arrest. that it was SRO generated, take out of the building and to juvenile court or family court or wherever they go. Not one respondent said that they arrested more than 5 in a school year. And the majority, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can tell you it was the majority that responded that they arrested 0. Now look, dividing this out and asking about on-view arrests is critical, because there are times that there might be a pickup order, a court pickup order, and it's dropped off to the SRO to execute. That's different than an on-view arrest. If the SRO didn't do it, somebody else would have. So my gosh, I'd rather the SRO do it instead of a patrol officer. You know, they're used to working with kids, the SRO is. So, but it's my point is, it's really hard from what I can see to really gather data around this. And I think the best way to do it is to engage with us on that issue. You know, that's just a tough one. I mean, without coming to the source.
Yeah, that's interesting. It just asking good questions of the data. Who, what, where, why, when, how much, how often, all those.
It is. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it is, you know, one of the frustrating things to me, and I try not to misuse data. When I talk about the juvenile arrest rate declining so significantly, again, I think you heard me say, not for, you know, in any way suggesting that's all because of SROs, not at all.
Right. Correlation, causation. Yeah.
So I really, it really bothers me when people do misuse data. And sometimes it's to support an agenda, and I get it, but I, you know, sorry, soapbox.
No worries. No worries. So I apologize, folks. I think I hogged a lot of question time, but does anybody want to unmute, and we can go a few minutes over if you can, and ask a question for Mo? One came in on the chat, and feel free to put another one in the chat or unmute after this one. But how have SROs engaged with students during COVID, and with the school's area support, and any insights into a best practice next year? In other words, maybe how has engagement during the pandemic changed for you and your members?
That's a great question by Susan. And yeah, Susan, we do have a mutual friend in John. I saw your introductory comments. Well, look, we've sought out, and we started this around April of last year. So about a year ago, we started seeking out input from SROs in terms of what they're doing, what's the situation, where do you find yourself? A lot of the SROs got really engaged in delivering meals, to the free and reduced price lunch meals to students. And so that was a great way, even at a distance, even at a 6-8 foot distance, whatever it was, for them to still interact with the students from their school.
They'll have that relationship.
Some of them got involved in Zoom and some of the Zoom classrooms, whether it's, you know, doing their maybe regular law-related education piece, or just visiting with students in that regard, and just, you know, checking in on them, seeing how they're doing. You know, some found themselves out serving the community in different ways. You know, some gradually, you know, school returned in person in some areas and continues to do so. And that brought about the return of many of the SROs to the school environment. You know, how we move forward coming out of COVID, coming out of this pandemic with students, I think goes back to the relationship issue. You know, one of the things about building good relationships is it helps to prepare a foundation for what things looks like when a crisis occurs. I've seen, and you all have seen, crisis occur in situations where there were not good relationships, where there was not a good foundation, and we see how that can unravel. But if we did our job before last March, then hopefully those relationships can be picked up as we, you know, continue to regather in schools and And again, hopefully a lot of us have been able to tend to those relationships even at a distance during this time. So I think it still goes back to relationships. I know I kind of pound that drum pretty loudly, but
No, that's great. I mean, to be frank, Mo, I mean, on all of our guest speakers who have expertise in their different areas, one or two key takeaways is probably all we're gonna, be able to carry forth and operate. So that I appreciate you hammering that, because that helps ground our focus and filter, because we have to rely on our student services for expertise in mental health. We have to rely on our SROs for expertise in law enforcement and youth and so forth. But we can at least have a primary filter to carry through to that. And that's what I appreciate you helping us bring. Does somebody else have a final question as we wrap here for Mo that you'd like to just unmute and chime in or put in the chat? Well, okay. I'm sure Guy would have, but I guess he had to drop off. I know. But anyway, I will wrap here with thanking you again, Mo, for your time and your willingness to join our conversation here. Please, everybody, send Mo a thanks on your way out in the chat. Appreciate your conversation. This, of course, will be recorded, is being recorded, will be put on our YouTube channel as part of our reference in the series to think about guidance for coming out of the pandemic related to keeping our schools safe and clean and supportive environments from infectious disease standpoint, from an academic standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, and this is be part of that conversation. So again, Mo, great, appreciate it very much. Thanks again, and then we'll keep you posted as these guidance documents comes together, and you can kind of see the contribution as it forms. So thanks for taking.
David.
All right.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Have a good evening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week when we have Kathleen Mintke on from National Association of School Psychologists. Thank you. Have a good evening.